Eugene, let's start with you and your reporting on these comments from Ron Klain. Interesting to me. Didn't seem like he really backed off the comments he made in the audio. What else do we need to know?
No, not at all. He said that he wasn't criticizing the president, but then went on and talked about the exact same things that I'd heard in that audio. And essentially what he was trying to say is that the kinds of things that he thinks works for this president is when he is talking like he talked in the State of the Union. That was something that came up over and over again when I spoke with him after I called him for comment after I heard the audio. And what he said was he wants to, the bridges are important. It is an important aspect of what the president has done, but he thinks the president is much better off when he is talking about a contrast between what he's doing on pricing and what the Republicans have or don't have, and what plans they have and don't have. Right? It is not something that went over well with folks in the Biden campaign and in the Biden White House. They're quite frustrated by this because they say these are the things that we are doing. Right? We are talking about lowering prices. But I think what Klain was getting at was some of the concerns that Democrats have, and Democrats are often people that are quite nervous. But the things that they're nervous about is that this is a campaign that talks about very lofty things, right? Like freedom and democracy, things that are not always easily defined for every single American. Everyone thinks about it a little differently, and so he's trying to push them to think about the things that are easily defined. We are a party that wants to lower drug prices, right? We are a party that cares about protecting Medicare and Social Security, which is what came up. I will say he's kind of backed off a little bit after my colleagues at West Wing Playbook talked to him. But I think the theory of the case is still there, that there's some concerns within the Democratic Party about what the message is for the Biden administration, the Biden campaign.
Right. And Ashley, I just want to be clear. The reason we're talking about this is because the stakes of this election could not be higher, because democracy itself is on the line. And I think part of what Democrats are working through is how you have a message that breaks through in what is a chaotic and asymmetric playing field, right? How do they make that contrast that Eugene just outlined? I wonder what you are hearing from Dems about what they believe that should look like.
Well, Eugene is right in the sense of democracy being kind of you could see that as a 101 lecture course in college, kind of lofty, kind of not that tangible. And so what Democrats are telling me is they have to make this real, the stakes and what democracy being on the ballot means in 2024. And so they think the most tangible way to do this is in part through January 6th, because there is still former President Trump is trying to do a lot of revisionist history, but there is a lot of real footage of what happened at the nation's capital that day. And it is violent and it is harrowing. And that is the sort of thing that, according to Democrats, we should expect to see in ads, in messaging, and reminding voters. For some people, it seems quite fresh. And for others, they think it's worth remembering when there were smoke bombs going off in the Capitol, when there's images of lawmakers fleeing for their lives, when there's protesters throwing things in camo, dressed in sort of for military battle, on the National Mall and outside the Capitol.
There's so much revisionist history, Miles, on the part of Republicans about what happened on January 6th, but there's also revisionist history on the part of voters about how the economy was under Donald Trump. And we know that even if everything breaks Joe Biden's way when it comes to these economic indicators over the next several months, you're still going to have Donald Trump and Republicans who are going to hammer him on the price of food, on the price of gas. He's going to continue to exaggerate his own economic record. I wonder how Democrats combat that, how they get out from under that.
Well, one thing I want to point out, Alicia, first is your point about January 6th and the revisionism. Yep. It's gotten into even deeper, crazy conspiratorial levels. I mean, just today, Sebastian Gorka, a flunky from Trump's universe, was talking about how there were intelligence officers from newly released filings that they found on Capitol Hill. I can tell you why there were people from the intelligence community there, because that's what happens when you call in law enforcement in the area. You've got people who safeguard CIA property and FBI property. You call in all these different law enforcement agencies. I've overseen those activations, but these guys read those tea leaves like there was a secret op against the country run by the intelligence community. I mean, it's getting wackier and wackier. It's a different reality entirely. Why is that connected to economics? Because those same weird conspiratorial views are bleeding over into conversations about things like inflation and the economy under Donald Trump. And in fact, some of these conspiracy theory folks think Joe Biden has a secret 4-dimensional chess that he's trying to do things in the economy. Look, it boils down to this. Whether you're a Democrat or you're a Republican, it's really tough to say the president of the United States is the one controlling the direction of the economy. That's just really, really difficult to do. An economy is a very complex system, like anything in the natural world, and it's difficult to ascribe it to one man or woman's actions. Yes, a president can have influence over that, but there's a lot of revisionist history about what happened under Donald Trump, including extraordinary levels of federal spending that happened under Donald Trump that drove inflation. As a conservative, it was something that was immensely frustrating to me during the Trump administration. Is he promised a smaller government, but instead was one of the biggest spenders, if not the biggest spender in American history. So a lot of what we've dealt with in terms of inflation really started during those Trump years.
Actually, one of the reasons I find what is happening in Arizona so interesting is because in many ways you can look at Arizona as a microcosm for what is happening politically all across this country. So just today, you had the state legislature. To me, it encapsulates the Republican position right now on abortion. They went into recess so they wouldn't have to vote on repealing the ban. When you look at what is happening in Arizona, what does it tell you about where national Republicans are, sort of the corner they have painted themselves into on this issue?
Well, this is the worst thing that could have happened to former President Trump and Republicans. It was sort of like a shot chaser, but the chaser brought no relief because you had President Trump coming out after going back and forth and wavering and finally making a statement that this should be left to the states. And before he made that, during this deliberations process, some of his advisors urged him to support the 15-week federal ban, but others warned him. They say, if you say that this goes back to the states, then you and Republicans own every state decision, even the ones that are too restrictive, and also the ones that your base thinks are not restrictive enough. And literally the next day, Arizona came out with perhaps one of the most restrictive rulings we can imagine. And it's been fascinating to see Kari Lake in Arizona distance herself from her own state's decision, and Trump, same thing. He says he wants it to the states, but then in that clip you played at the beginning of the show, he said, but Arizona did the wrong thing and they're going to straighten themselves out. And it's not really states' rights if you want to dictate what the state will do. So it's an incredibly tough position for Trump and Republicans to be in. And you will see Democrats and President Biden and Vice President Harris hammer this every single day and make them own every single state decision that is politically problematic.
Right. And part of the reason that is necessary, Eugene, is because of the way that the former president likes to bob and weave on this issue, sort of have his cake and eat it too, where he both wants credit for the overturning of Roe v. Wade, but he does not in any way want to take credit for something like this abortion ban that we're seeing out of Arizona. What are you hearing from Democrats? What are you hearing from the Biden team about the way they really hold his feet to the fire on this issue?
It's by repetition. It's by every single time that former President Trump or Kari Lake or really any Republican tries to back away a little bit from some of these decisions that are happening on the state level that many think are too restrictive, is by pointing that out. And more importantly, reminding people something that Trump reminds us all the time, which is that he is the reason that Roe v. Wade was overturned, right? He put 3 justices on the Supreme Court that did that. So he is struggling as someone who loves to crow about the kinds of things that he has done, the kinds of things that he made promises on and then kept those promises. And also that promise being something that is a vulnerability for not just him, but his entire party since Roe v. Wade was overturned. And what you are going to see from this campaign, especially moving forward, is pointing that out in those swing states, right? Arizona and Florida are really interesting because, for many reasons, but they're both likely to have some kind of referendum literally on the ballot about abortion. Florida, probably not a swing state anymore, as much as Democrats hope that it is. But Arizona kind of is really in play. And so when you talk to Arizona Democrats and national Democrats who are going to be spending a lot of time and money there, what they will tell you is that we are going to spend every single day reminding everyone that the reason that we're having this conversation starts and ends with Donald Trump, and also that Donald Trump, on his own abortion thought process for years, has kind of been all over the place. At one point, he said women should be punished. He was pro-choice in a past life, and now he is where he is. So they want to tell the voters, you can't trust him on abortion. He says he's not going to sign a ban, but this is a man who has issues with the truth, and that's another aspect of this, is reminding people that he lies from time to time.
Hey everyone, MSNBC has a new and improved app. You'll get real-time alerts and analysis, live blogs, in-depth essays, video highlights, and the best 2024 election coverage. Download the new MSNBC app. Here's how to do it. You tap on the App Store on your phone. You hit search on the bottom right corner. You type in MSNBC. You click on the MSNBC app. You click on Get or the cloud icon and enjoy it.